All right. Aloha kako and good evening. My name is Dr. Britton Brooks, and I'm a lecturer in medieval Buddhist literature here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm also the founder and director of Converging Epistemologies and these events. So, our theme tonight, as you do know if you saw a poster, and probably why you came here on a Friday night instead of doing something else, is posthumanism and transhumanism. Or, in a sense, more loosely, what we're talking about tonight is the future of humanity. But what does it mean to be human? Is it our bipedal structure, our bones, cells, and genes? Is it our creativity, will, empathy, our intellect? Is it our languages, stories, songs, art, relationships? Is it our senses, mingled and granted meaning by our brains? Is it our souls, the self stretching onward beyond the borders of the known? What is it that makes us us? It takes a cosmos to make a human, SETI researcher Jill Tarter. We are made of star stuff, the great Carl Sagan. Each of these great minds point to the heart of our dialogue tonight, as they recognize the interconnected interdependence of the human and the cosmic, and the way that defines our humanity. Our constituent parts were birthed in the hearts of stars, jettisoned in explosions of light, energy, and cast out across the universe, only to be drawn together, woven through gravity, chemistry, biology, evolution, language, culture, history, choice, to create each of you sitting here this evening. We are star stuff, but we are also earth stuff, bound to this rocky sphere with its mountains and valleys, its oceans and glaciers, its forests and deserts. The sight of deep green, of chlorophyll capturing photon, pierces our psychology. The familiar sensorium of our homes contribute to our sense of self. For me, salt on the air, ocean on my skin, my son's hearty laughter, my wife's smile beneath our Pacific stars. We are embodied, and this embodiment has implication. Place matters. It makes us and defines us. Yet we are also explorers, and even now we imagine a future where humans are born, live, and die on Mars. What would that mean? How would our biology, psychology, daily life change? When we live beneath carbon fiber plates, breathe recycled air, our soundscape metal on metal instead of bird song, our sensorium locked within the artificial, only our eyes drinking in the natural, vision various hues of red and forms of stone, the foundation of our visual world. But we explore to know, don't we? To answer questions of origin, purpose, and end. Where did life begin? Earth? Another planet? What will it mean for us, woven of cosmic dust, to find life elsewhere, beneath moons of ice in our own solar system? And bolder still, our search to replicate life, to mimic consciousness, thought, reason with interlaced silicon. What will it mean with algorithmic neural connections learned, improved, and can drive me home? That part I absolutely look forward to. Please tell me it's happening soon. Friday nights will be way more fun then. Will an artificial intelligence become indistinguishable from a human intelligence? Will it be greater? Will it be moral? Will it need us? Our ingenuity also turns itself on us, and we seek to better our human forms. Yet how far or could we change? When would we cease to be human? With technologies like CRISPR, we can edit our genes, eradicate disease, and we are seeking even now to treat the universal human limiter of all human good and evil, death. If we become deathless, would we still be human? If we augment our minds, expand our range of senses, how might we then define what it means to be human? These are the questions our esteemed panel will discuss tonight. So let us come together in this place and dream ourselves forward, but also remain rooted, connected, creatures of story, history, and science. And do look up when you leave this place. Travel back with your gaze to the beginning of stars, nebula, planets, and marvel that the pulse of your heartbeat is the result of the unfolding symphony of this cosmos in which we now find ourselves. These are our thoughts to begin this evening. And we have an extraordinary panel before you, and it's enough of me talking. Let's hear about the actually interesting people in the room. So if you could please introduce yourselves and your field and what it is you work on.
Aloha e kako. I'm Karen Jolly. I'm a professor in the history department. Can you all hear me? Good. My specialty, I'm not quite sure why I'm mixed into this panel, is medieval European history. So I'm the humanist in the bunch, but my particular interest in the past has been in looking at the history of magic, religion, and science as concepts in the Western tradition and the ways in which those are invented constructs. I'm also a reader of historical fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and eclectically across a range of essays in our culture. So you can check my Kindle and find out what kind of person I am. I'm also a bit of a countercultural Christian thinker in the sense that I challenge and question the world system in which we live and the assumptions we make. And so some of my concerns today are ethical ones.
Okay, I'm next. So my name is Veronica Bindi. As you can guess from my accent, I'm not from Hawaii. I'm from Italy, but I found home in this place 5 years ago. So when I got a position at the physics department of the University of Hawaii, I got my first degree in astronomy and then into physics. And I travel all over the places. I've been for many years in Switzerland, then I've been in the Netherlands at the European Space Agency, then in Cape Canaveral, in Florida, and in Houston for some times. And after that, I ended up coming here in Hawaii. I have to say that together with Italy are the most beautiful places. Yes. So what I'm doing, I study the constituent of matter. So I have an instrument that has been installed on the International Space Station in 2011. We are taking data from space. What are these data coming from space? Are particles coming from all over the places in our galaxy and even beyond the galaxy. And so we are studying the constituent of matter to see if outside we have matter that is different from here, from what we are made of, something new. Who knows? And I'm also studying what is called a dark matter, that is the major part of what we think is the constituent of our universe. And because we are measuring all these particles in space, NASA is really interested in understanding these particles because these particles are called space radiation, and unfortunately they are not that healthy for the human body, but also for satellites, for communications in general, and in space. So our astronauts, if they want to stay for a long period of time in space, like they're already doing in the space station, but if they want to stay longer period of time and go back to the moon or go to Mars, we need to protect them for these particles. So we are working with possible shielding and possible future spacecraft to be able to send them there safely.
Hi, I'm Kim Binstead. I'm a professor in the Information and Computer Sciences department here. My background, I did my undergraduate degree in physics in Montreal. I did my PhD in artificial intelligence at the University of Edinburgh. My dissertation topic was computational humor. So I wrote a program that makes up very bad puns, but they are puns, and that's the main thing. Would you like to hear one?
Yes.
Yes, please.
What do you call a Martian who drinks beer? An alien. That's one of the better ones. So, JAPE, Joke Analysis and Production Engine, generated thousands of terrible puns. But I did it. I don't know if it really ties in with what we're doing today, but I did it in part because humor is very much a popular standard for humanity. In science fiction, you always see the robot who, when he hears a joke, goes, "Does not compute," or who can't possibly understand a joke. And I think Star Trek had an entire episode based on Data getting a humor chip. So it does seem to be something that we feel is pretty close to humanity's heart. Here at UH, I'm the principal investigator on the High Seas project. So that's the dome on Mauna Loa on the Big Island where we're trying to reduce or remove some of the risks of long-duration human space exploration by studying how humans behave when they're trapped in a small space for long periods of time. So we've had missions that are 4 months long, 8 months long, 12 months long in a very small dome, simulating the Mars exploration part of a long-duration space mission. And I'm happy to talk about all of that. I actually have after the PhD, master's in planetary geology, where we were trying to understand where Earth's water came from. And Karen can speak more to that than I can.
Thank you.
Right, my name is Karen Meach. I started out my career in physics, space physics at Rice University, and then got a degree in planetary physics at MIT, and then decided I really wanted to come out to the observatories, so I got my very first job out here in Hawaii in 1987 as faculty here at UH. Starting with the pure planetary physics, I've now migrated into the field of astrobiology, which is a much newer field. And this deals with the search for life elsewhere, but not just what you think of in science fiction in terms of alien life, but the conditions under which life could originate in other worlds, where you might find habitats that's suitable for life, and how life might be different than on Earth. Now, one of the big research areas I'm looking at now, however, is how do you form a world that could be habitable? And I think the key is water, which is something very dear to Hawaii. Water is made in space, and it certainly was around when our planets were formed, but how did it actually get to Earth? And that's a problem that really has been intriguing because it involves bringing together various disciplines, not just astronomy. It's going to require geology, geophysics, people who study meteorites, and bringing them all together, I think, is what's making some fascinating science. And so to do that, we're trying to design space missions to understand where water came from.
Excellent, thank you very much. And so without sort of further ado in that, you know something of our extraordinary panel. We're going to start with our first question, which again, as I joke in every one of these events, is definitions, because again, we are scholars and we spend our entire day just defining stuff, particularly for humanists. It's like our whole goal.
Yes.
I'm going to define this term first. We hit our students over the head with that, define your terms. So we're going to do that to show a good example of this. So our first question for the panel is, what is the difference between the terms posthuman, transhuman, or posthumanism and transhumanism, and are these terms useful? Who would like to jump in? You want to go, Karen?
I did want to make a distinction, at least initially, that the other three may want to pick up on, and that is, you just now said post-human, transhuman, and then post-humanism, transhumanism, and I could even push it so far as to say post-humanities. But I'll leave that one aside for the moment. So I think there's a difference between talking about post-human and post-humanism. So most people in the humanities, when they hear post-human, they think science in terms of either the evolutionary end of Homo sapiens sapiens and somehow something else replacing that, evolving into something else, or humans modifying themselves genetically to perform some kind of conscious evolution that then becomes something other than Homo sapiens. Eugenics or transhuman. I'm very curious about transhuman because I'm not quite sure what that term means, but it appears, at least in pop culture sci-fi, to involve introducing genes or modifying the genes from other species, perhaps, to modify humans, the human genome, or embedding technologies into the human body that permanently alter it. So to me, that's post-human, transhuman. But post-humanism has a particular meaning within the humanities, and postmodernism is the death of Enlightenment reasoning. That is, humanism is a movement from, historically speaking, from the Enlightenment, and some people believe in postmodernism that that's dead. The humanities are dead. Humanism is dead. Transhumanism, then, would be the idea that we can remake ourselves into something other than Homo sapiens, divorcing ourselves from our ancestors, the end of history. No need for history. We're not the same people as those people back then. We're a different entity. And that's very prevalent in pop culture. So I would suggest that posthumanism, as a form of postmodernism, the abandonment of Enlightenment reasoning, where you have claims, proof, evidence, that the humanities have ceded the territory to the sciences. We've killed ourselves. We've allowed the only reasonable people to be in the natural sciences and those methods, and we've abandoned the kind of logic and reasoning that philosophy, history, and other disciplines in the humanities have traditionally done. And so that would be a sort of post-humanities scenario. So that's my defining terms issue, is the isms and the ities on the end.
Okay. Well,
You want to jump in?
Yeah.
what I want to say is that if I well understood what transhumans are, just to make it more simple for a person that is not a philosopher, not an historian, not a revolutionary. So what I understood is that we are in a time where we do believe that machines will be always more and more heavily impacting our life. They are already doing it. I mean, we all have in our pocket our phones. So the only difference is now is the fact that they are still outside our bodies most of the time. Because for some of the people, like you see Stephen Hawking that just passed away, he was heavily dependent on a machine, and also people with pacemaker, or that they have hearts that are reconstructed, and so we depend in technologies, and this is if we look at the trend, technologies is becoming more and more also provides always more services to us, so it makes our life so easy that it's quite impossible to stop this. It's like an evolution, you know. It's like we need to follow that somehow. We are in the middle of it, so we cannot just go away outside without a GPS. It will take forever. So in everyday life, these technologies are becoming more present in our life. Now, transhumans from the fictions is what generally is more considered like you take part of this hardware and you put in your body, and not just to be what you were already doing it, or what you were already in the past, like a machine that helps you to survive. It's not that, but it's more like an extension, becoming a human plus with superpowers, with extra memories, with I don't know, maybe I just want to see, instead of the optics, I want to become a sort of a astronomer's eye, where I can see also different wavelengths, and being able to listen to what people in the next room are talking about, you know. So you could expand this in the way you want, or also to become extend your life even to longer period of time. Now the new 50s, they all say that the new 50s look like the whole 30s, right? And so we all, it's like we stop somehow aging. We are improving our capabilities thanks to technologies, and so transhumans, I don't know if we can consider ourselves already transhumans, because these technologies are most of the time outside our body. But at the time when they will become part of us, then we are transhumans. I mean, we are what in fiction will be called the cyborg, right? If we are able to say, why should I use this hand if I can have a super powerful hand that does different things? But yeah.
I was just going to say that I see the definitions as being quite different if you see it as a technologist, as a futurist, or as an ethicist. So as a technologist, you ask, can we change ourselves with technology? As a futurist, we say, will we change ourselves with technology? And as an ethicist, we say, should we change ourselves with technology? And I'm none of those things. I guess I can say we can change ourselves with technology. I'm looking at a room full of people sitting on artificial things, wearing artificial things in an artificial space. We're surrounded by things we've made all the time, including things we put in our body, the foods we put in. So I would argue that there's a spectrum. We look to science fiction for, I think we think of, literally like changing our arm out or something like that. But if I use a fancy piece of equipment at the gym that wouldn't have been available to my ancestors to improve the strength of my arm, is that technology changing us? Maybe a little bit from the start. So anyway, that's all I had to say on that.
I don't know, I struggle to think of the definitions of trans and posthumanism, because I'm finding my mind wandering to what does it mean to be human to begin with. And I start thinking about things from the astrobiology point of view, And we may not even be from Earth. We could have started out on Mars because it's far easier to eject a piece of rocky material from Mars to have it land on Earth than the other direction. So do you have to have started the whole process of evolution by beginning on Earth to even be called human, or does it really matter? So that's what I was left thinking with.
Okay. That's an excellent segue to question 2. Which actually does, our second question for the panel is, what does it mean to be human? As I suggested in my introduction, we have our bodies, we are physically distinct. Do we have an intellect? We have a will? Is our ability to empathize, to imagine the emotions of others? Is it our ability to be creative? To what? What exactly about these various factors makes us human? We don't have to go online, you can sort of jump in at any point.
Well, I have a small terrier called Cosmo. And
It's a great name.
Yeah, thank you. And he ain't human, but he is mildly intelligent. He experiences emotions, he forms bonds, he imagines things all the time, because he has barking fits when there's nothing there. Anyway, I guess, there's a lot of these features that he cares about things and people that he knows, I believe. And so there's a lot of these things that we kind of think about as human, which actually apply to a lot of the higher mammals, I would say. So how does humanity distinguish itself, aside at a purely sort of species level of what we can breed with and what we can't? The biggest part has to be our use of technology. I think other animals use technology to some extent, using a stick to get an insect out of a tree and that kind of thing. But I think we're unusual in that we can't do without our technologies.
But were we not human before we had technology?
Yes.
If I can jump on it,
Yeah.
I think that more than technology is the capability to transmit, to tell a story about what we have done before, that it goes to the present and get transport to the future, and working together to improve. So improvement is telling the story of what there was before,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to trying to improve what we do have.
I would throw in there, I think there's probably a feeling in the room, a common sense feeling that we know that humans are different, but we can't quite figure out what it is. So G.K. Chesterton in the early part of the 20th century has this whole thing on the caveman. And scientists and people wandering to, say, Lascaux or Chauvet, and they see these cave paintings and they may say, oh, primitive man, or this, that, and the other. They come up with all these theories, but an ordinary person walks into the cave, looks at the white walls, and they don't say, gee, I wonder if a squirrel did this, or a rabbit, or a bear. No, you look at it and you say, humans did this. They might have been Neanderthals, they might have been Homo sapiens sapiens, they might have been some mixture thereof, but you know that it's human. And the question is, why? I don't have an answer for that. But I think it's important to come back to that common sense that we know that there's something a little different about the way that we exist and think about ourselves in the world and do stuff with art, with technology, with all of these things, that we see a little bit of in an animal.
Mm-hmm.
But I would suggest that one of it is the storytelling and the abstract reasoning are things we need to look at. We have abstract concepts. We don't know if any animals do or not, because it's very hard to tell, because they don't have the language that we can learn from them to see if they have abstract concepts. Do they understand the concept of beauty? The concept, do they have concepts? Like we extrapolate from material existence something that is not material. So I throw that out there as one possible way of thinking our way through the problem, but I don't have a definitive answer.
Anyone else? Want to jump in? No?
Oh, just one little thing on the technology. One way that humans have of putting other humans to death is exposure. That's simply removing all of your supporting technologies and putting you outside. Humans die of exposure, of not having all of the things, all of our extra technologies on us. And I don't know if that's necessarily true of, well, I mean, I think it's unusual. I think it's surprising for something that's evolved in an environment that we will die if we don't have our technologies.
But that's because we moved into environments inhospitable, right?
I don't think there's any environment where, I mean, maybe Hawaii.
I mean, people live in the
Maybe.
People live in the Kalahari Desert, right?
With spears and houses and
But with
technologies
knowledge.
with no
right?
yes, but then
and then you would invent those technologies. Any individual can do that.
sure. I guess what I'm saying is yeah. So clearly, if you actually were exposed, you would immediately set about remaking the
Right,
things
right,
that you need.
exactly.
But if you are unable to make the things you need to protect yourself, you die. And I think that's a kind of a surprising thing for an animal.
Right, our reliance on our ability to create technology.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Interesting. Yeah.
So we have a host of definitions going around here, but I think a few of the more salient ones seem to be this emphasis on as a combination of abstract reasoning and creativity, which involves things like the creation of technology. And I think it's a fair point. But I think, and again, we're doing some great segues. I'm loving this. This is just making my life so easy. Segueing into our next question, which is in the realm of the artificial. So I suppose I'm going to ask you two questions at the same time and let this sort of run its course. The question is, at what point, let's say if these are our parameters, what it means to be human, at what point, let's say we modify ourselves with a variety of means internally? Because I think that's an interesting distinction. This, the external we don't think of as being particularly post-human, right? If I, and even small internal changes, like I had to go get a bunch of shots. I'm moving to Japan. They're like, here, you need a shot for everything under the sun, right? That is modifying the way my body works via technology. But we don't think of that as a change. But I do think you're right. This kind of, the level to which we put technology into us means something. So I think if we bring those all together, the question is, at what point does doing that push us to a place where we are something that is distinctly different, that we would no longer consider human? And connected to that is how that relates to something like artificial intelligence. Because if you could create an artificial intelligence that, let's say, could, through its own ingenuity, create new tech, depend on tech, it could transmit knowledge, it could create art, it could possibly consider abstract concepts, does the definition of human therefore fall away? Or so as the two-part question, one is, at what point does the modification of ourselves make us something that is we would no longer consider to be human? And also, how does the potential role of artificial intelligence to do these things we've just defined as human problematize our discussion?
I'm gonna turn that question around if you don't mind.
Yes, please do.
So as you pointed out, it's possibly possible for a transhuman or artificial intelligence to have all of the characteristics we just identified as being human, in the sense that the things that distinguish us from being animals.
Right.
So I think the question is when does our technology stop us from being an animal?
Oh, okay.
When do we cease to be animals? And so, okay, so when does humanity stop being animal? Probably when we either do away with bodies or we make our own bodies, rather than making bodies through reproduction. That's a biggie. When we design ourselves. When we're not reliant on resources like food, air, water, that's when we stop being animals. We'll need other resources presumably, but those are biggies.
But so do you think that it's just, I don't know how to say it, it's only a problem of needs that makes you human, the fact that you are like an animal in the sense of needs, or the fact that, for instance, if we will be able to transfer all my memory and all my sensation into a chip, and transfer this chip into a machine, so that think exactly like me, has my same feelings and everything, would that be a human?
Well, I guess this is my question. I think that right now humans are animals. We're weird animals, but we're animals. So when we talk about sort of post-humanity, we're talking about, can we have all the things we just talked about as being important to our humanity? Can we have that and not be animals?
So it's more related to the body.
Yes, yeah.
To the
That assumes that what makes us
Probabilities of
human
the
is
book.
only biologically based.
No, so I'm kind of saying the opposite. I'm saying there's a category of things that we see as being human that don't have anything necessarily to do with biology.
Or
So-
neurology.
Right. And
Okay.
so I'm saying,
it's-
so maybe posthumanism is when we keep all of those characteristics, but we ditch the animal part.
So the will, the soul, the spirit, the whatever that's not materially based, how could it be transferred via a material thing like a chip? If it doesn't exist in any, set of neurons. In other words, is there a part of being human that is not based upon the material stuff that's up here in my gut apparently too?
I think that's the question, right?
But
That
it
is the
seems-
question.
It seems to me if you don't have the biology involved, you're not going to have evolution, and part of us changing and becoming better is because you're combining different things in a random way. And so if you get rid of the body, are you just cloning a machine then?
Right.
Well, okay, but if
But
I'm
what
devil's
if the
advocate
machine
here.
improve itself?
Yeah.
So it's changing. It's
But you like
modifying itself.
random change because that's where you get the unexpected.
Okay, but if we're super smart machines, we know that, and so we will introduce random change. Where if
Why would you do that?
Because that's going to go backwards. That's going to go wrong.
Should we do that? Well, but I think we're also being constrained here by the evolutionary model because we are so trained in our modern Western thought that the only thing that really can be proven to exist is material reality, and we can measure, natural sciences can mark and measure all of these things, and we learn more and more. So we have this idea that evolution also takes on a meaning beyond the biological to social evolution, which I will disagree with, to human evolution, as if evolution in what it means to be human is taking place. But evolution is just a word. It's a word drawn from the natural sciences, from Darwin and subsequent scientists who have exploited that concept, and it's a very powerful one for explaining material reality. But it may not explain who we are.
Yeah, evolution is a mechanism. I think of evolution to change. Evolution as to change as the free market is to an economy. It's one way of producing change, but you can also design change. Evolution is super powerful. Don't get me wrong, but there's other ways of changing.
Right. But should we?
Yeah, that's a different question.
Because technology is not new. I mean, I run into this with my students all the time, this belief that somehow we currently living today in the modern world are different from all humans who lived before us because of our technology. No, we're not. They've been using technology, as you were pointing out, Kim, we've always been using technologies. Now, the kinds of technologies we're using are different, and they are accelerating change.
Yes.
And they're challenging us, but all of these technologies come with pros and cons. You can make a spear to kill an animal to eat for dinner, and you can use that spear to kill your neighbor. You can split the atom, and you can also blow up Hiroshima. So, I think we need to look at the ethical components of the kinds of choices that we're talking about.
Yeah, but technology can also help you in the ethical component, right?
In what?
In the ethical component, technology can also support you and help you.
Right,
Like
right.
in the sense, before our diet, if you look
Right.
at our diet in the past, was we were eating meat, we were eating vegetables, and it was the only possible way. Nowadays, there are people that they believe that also animals shouldn't be eaten because they are something that is getting more and more closer to our human being. And so they decided that they do not want, and they still can live with making this type of choice. And in the
Right.
future, we might decide to live a complete different
Yes.
way, and also the way that we have to for
But
sickness.
who decides? I'm a historian. I'm here to tell you that it's about power. It's about who has power over other people, and the power will use the technology for their own purposes against oppressed peoples. Sorry, that's the history. It's not constant, but these technologies, these changes always fall into the hands of people who will use them for their own good and not for the good necessarily of the humans. So if there's a transhuman, we aren't all going to be transhumans, folks. Some of us are going to be the ones working in, the mines
But-
or whatever. So, I mean, the human condition morally hasn't changed. That's my argument.
But speaking about history, so I'm Italian, and you know that one of the few things that the Roman Empire did in a very good way were streets and all the system to bring water. So if now you can just go to your home and take a hot shower, you have to thank the technologies of that time, because before they were going to who knows where, and most of the people, I mean, we still see this problem in some part of the world where there are not technologies, where technologies are not developed.
But they don't
So-
have them because humans withhold them from people. And the Roman Empire created waterways, but only people in positions of power had access to that clean water.
I'm
And
not
the
that
slaves
powerful,
who built it,
but
okay.
okay.
But I'm saying that, yes, we're part of the 10% sitting here, okay?
No, so I mean, I take the points, and I think I'll bring us back to a couple of central things that were spoken about. One was the question about the loss of random evolution if we get to a point where we're designing everything. And so one thing I want to say about that is, I mean, to some degree, we already, I mean, some people have argued that we already are to some degree stymieing any kind of human evolution, right? Because we, through medicine, through all our scientific advancements, we are essentially helping people live who would not have lived otherwise. When we go back to the Stephen Hawking example, right? I mean, amazing mind, contributed great to understanding the universe, but without medical advancements, we would have lost that.
I think from a purely
Yes.
sort of evolutionary point of view,
Yes.
we're not stymieing evolution at all,
Okay.
because we are still reproducing
We are.
in an environment.
Right.
What we're doing is changing the environment.
I see.
And so different traits become the traits that allow you to successfully reproduce.
Right.
And that's all that evolution cares about, is
Right.
the
Yeah,
babies.
the ability to reproduce.
So all we're doing is changing the environment,
Okay.
shifting the goalposts.
Interesting.
But just in terms of evolution versus design, so in AI, one of the techniques for doing design and doing really good design is evolutionary algorithms. So, for example, there are these antennas. It's very challenging to design antennas. It's very hard to know exactly which ones are going to perform well, sort of a priori. So instead, this is a colleague of mine, he set up a genetic algorithm which essentially breeds thousands and thousands of antenna designs and tests them against each other in the same way that evolution works. And it produces these really weird-looking antennas that work great. So even if you are top-down designing, he's saying, I want to design a great antenna, he's using evolution to do it.
Right.
And so I think there's a possibility that our transhumans might do that as well. It's not like they're not going to necessarily throw out a good technique. They might keep evolution because it works well.
I like that.
It's efficient.
If I could draw us to a sort of second thing that you were all talking about, and it alludes back to another thing I mentioned in the beginning, that I would argue that part of what makes us human, at least in the moment, going back to your animal point, is that we are embodied, right? I mean, so this idea of transferring your consciousness, lots of pop culture which does this, right? Altered Carbon, Brooksy, Netflix, you watch it after this. It's basically just this whole discussion, but in a Netflix series. Go binge it.
Go home, watch TV.
Okay. Please don't actually. Okay, so the point there, right, is that I would, I suppose, throw into this that there is something intrinsically human about being embodied, about the fact that we interpret the world through our specific set of senses, our brain does specific things with them, and as much as animal intelligence goes, they also have different ways of perceiving the world, right? We only see a specific spectrum of light, we can only feel specific sensations, and that it develops who we are, right? It develops how we understand the world, develops the ways in which we speak about the world. Our metaphors are based on this, right? We, in a sense, think of what it means to be human based on our placeness almost, right? And our location and our relationship to those stimuli. So I do wonder in our discussions of both the post/transhuman, but also the question of artificial intelligence and its potential humanness, the embodied question, because I think I'm trying to problematize this by saying I think part of what makes human is that. And if we're not just minds, we're not just intellect, right? And my worry particularly in terms of things like transhumanism or artificial intelligence is a loss of that, is a loss of the connectedness to the world through those specific senses, which I think has helped us develop what it means to be human.
Well, how would you remain an individual if you don't have a body or some sort of encapsulation? I mean, life, when it started, you didn't start life until you formed the cell wall, the lipid membrane, because you had to contain a set of biochemical reactions.
Right.
So without a container, how would we be individuals, and how would you interact with some other entity? So I think you would have to have,
Yeah.
Yeah.
A body of some sort.
yeah.
I guess I have a question for the artificial intelligence people, is defining this, because artificial intelligence is different than an artificial human,
Right.
right? So
Right.
artificial intelligence simply chooses certain components of human intelligence and tries to get a machine to do them. But it probably, is the goal of artificial intelligence to recreate all of the human capabilities or just the intelligence aspects?
Well, so for what it's worth, people in artificial intelligence are trying to do a lot of different things.
Okay.
So some are trying to understand human intelligence by trying to replicate it on a machine.
Right.
That's what I was trying to do with the humor
Right.
thing. Some are trying to produce intelligence, whether it's human-like or not. And so in that case, sometimes it's inspired by the way the human brain does things, but we don't, if it turns out to be very, very different from human intelligence, that's fine too. But coming back to the embodiment question, one of the things we're finding is that if you want to create a human-like intelligence, it's quite a good idea to embody it. Because then you have a system that is learning about the world in the same kind of way that humans learn about the world, and that produces something closer to a human-like intelligence. I do think, though, we're currently in a resurgence of AI. AI goes through phases of popularity. It's a big one right now. And I think what we're seeing now is a shift towards super intelligence that doesn't have much to do with human intelligence. It's very, it's the big company, it's goal-oriented, right? They're trying to achieve very difficult things with a computer. So, and I think that's where true AI is going to come from. I don't think it's going to be particularly human-like at all.
Okay, that helps, because I've been reading a book. Has anyone read The Runaway Species? It was reviewed in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it's a book that I sort of like, but I'm finding incredibly irritating. It's what is it? The subtitle. It's The Runaway Species. How human creativity remakes the world. So I thought, well, that's interesting in light of what we're doing. And it's written by a neuroscientist and an artist. And the basic premise is pretty, anyone's read it? Okay. The basic premise at the outset is that when we look at the Apollo 13 disaster and how the engineers solved those problems, and we look at Picasso as an artist, that the same processes are taking place in the human brain. There's some kind of creativity that's at work that's the same processes, neurologically speaking. And then they talk about three major forms of creativity that have defined human endeavors and defined humans as different from animals: bending, breaking, and blending. And I was fine with all of that. The thing that irritated me was and it's written for a general audience, so maybe I shouldn't be so picky, but it uses terminology loosely. So on some occasions it talks about Mother Nature. I'm sorry, there is no Mother Nature. There is no agency. Nature isn't an entity unless you happen to believe in that entity. I can put you in touch with the prayers for that. That's one of my specialties. But Mother Nature, they talk about Mother Nature in a sentence as the subject of a verb. I'm like, you can't do that. But the main thing that bothered me is throughout it's using software as the analogy for the human brain. And this just really irked me because it's backwards. Software, my husband codes, software is created by a human mind and it uses human thinking as its model. So you can't turn the analogy around and say, well, the human mind is like software. Because software is only a little bit like the human mind, and there's other parts of the human person that are different, that aren't in software. So to run around just saying, well, the human mind works just like software is silly. it really bothered me. I don't know if that's just because I'm trained more in intellectual history and philosophy, or whether that's a problem in the sciences as well. This kind of loose use of
Well, I mean, we've had different analogies for how the human mind works as our technologies have gone along. I mean, when steam engines came in, people started talking about the mind as if it was a steam engine,
That's right.
and so
Yeah.
and then it sort of shifts as our technologies go along. We have different metaphors. But what we're talking about when we're talking about abandoning the body, that is definitely following that metaphor of saying that the key things that we care about,
Are
care
software.
about, the things that make humanity as opposed to an animal, are software things, not hardware things. And so that metaphor is very powerful. But you're right. I think that what goes on in us is much squishier.
yeah. And,
I like the squishiness. That's a brilliant way of looking
although, to be fair, the reason why technology keeps coming up here as models and metaphors in the modern era is because of basically the death of God. That is, once you move away from a theocentric or multiple gods or whatever else you want out there, you're hard pressed to figure out what. In other words, it used to be that you said, well, the human mind was created in the image of God, for example, in the Western Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions. So you had an external, infinite model out there, creator. You had a creator and a creation. But once you got rid of that, you stopped talking about the soul. You stopped talking about God doing something, because that's not scientifically provable in any way, shape, or form. So you have to reify nature. So nature gets a capital N, and nature does this. And so I think it's sometimes a loose way of talking about science in a kind of almost pseudo-religious way that I find deeply disturbing.
Yeah.
Interesting. So we're landing in the scientism realm.
Yes, that's what scientism, not science.
I said it, scientism.
Natural science.
Okay. We are already at 6:30, so if the panel doesn't mind, I'd like us to move on to a slightly different set of questions, if that's okay. And the second part of our questions tonight primarily have to deal with space travel, with our leaving, talk about embodied and not embodied, but leaving the Earth and going somewhere else in our own bodies, at least at the moment, before we download ourselves into some robot that can live forever and send them off to Alpha Centauri, which sounds cool. Sign me up for that. But until that moment, so my next question is primarily to do with what would it mean if, let's say, given that it's the nouveau thing, to colonize Mars for people? And what I mean by this is to cover all bases. So on one hand, there's the biological aspect, right? We are humans. We were, we're from this planet with a specific set of environmental factors that produce our livability, allow us to be essentially to thrive. And we are, of course, trying to recreate that to some extent when we colonize another planet. So my question is, what does it mean for us biologically, psychologically, socially, all of the above, to do that kind of a thing? What would it mean if a baby was born on Mars? What would it mean for them in terms of their identity? I mean, we place so much of our identity is based on place. I am from this place, you are from that place. Our language marks us out, right? And so, if you were born on Mars, what would that be? And then, of course, it goes back to the power question. Who's going to get to go? I mean, with all due respect to all the great ideas, I'm not Elon Musk. I'm not going to get to go. But, unless I make, buddy with him and he chucks me on his, next SpaceX thing, I will likely not get to go.
You'll be in the car.
Oh, no, I'm going to be, greasing the wheels by that point. But on the bottom, with, yeah, please take me with you. But so, there's also that question, right? Who will be the people who get to go? And from a group of people who, let's say, who do start the first settlement, what would that mean? What kind of political structure? We talked a bit about before this event. So just anything to do with what does it mean to actually colonize another planet?
That's like 4,000 questions.
I know.
That is gonna.
I know. So you start with anything we want to jump into the what would it mean for humans to actually colonize Mars?
Do you know who I feel really, really, really sorry for?
Who?
The second generation on Mars. Okay, so the first generation, they're people who spent their entire lives training for it. They're the scientists, the engineers. They fought off thousands of competitors to get there. They get to Mars. They set up their colony. They have kids. There's a reversion to the mean. Their kids don't get to be anything but Martian astronauts. They don't get to have sort of choose from all of the possibilities that are available to humans on Earth, they're stuck with it. So I think there's going to be a terrible revolution come the second generation on Mars.
But who knows if they're stuck in there? I mean, they might also decide to move in a different place. I mean,
I think it'd be very hard physically to come back to Earth.
yeah, but I think that from some point of view, I think are like our explorers from the past, you know, like our explorers that arrived to this one, the Polynesian that arrived to these wonderful highlands, or I mean, I've been this Christmas time. I was in Portugal, and they have even a monument to the explorers, because at that time the world was very small and was the only thing they know. And at that time, it was also. Some of the people started first. Let's put it this way. Some of the people started first to explore new territories. And at that time, they didn't have robots like we do have now that tells you already what to expect. So they were even more complicated, I would say, some of the adventures that what we want to do right now. Now we want to do it without any casualties or anything, and we don't want to take risks, too many risks. And so that's why I think that Elon Musk has a very high probability to arrive to Mars first, because it looks like he wants to take the risks, like when we went to the moon, more than what NASA or our people are more cautious and think, no, there is this risk and this other thing and this other thing. So, but I think that is going to be very impressive for us if we manage to do such a thing, because it's like opening up new opportunities, new possibilities. Can you imagine all the development that you have to do in order to provide these type of things? And this generates creativity. There is creativity, there is interdisciplinary in the fields to understand how can we do that, how can we simply be able to do these things. And I believe, going back to transhumans and all these things, that the first that probably will try to do such a thing might be people on Mars, because Mars is way harsher than what it will be here in Antarctica, for instance, where none of us probably will go to live ever. So it is a very complicated environment where to survive, and so people are, in that case, they have a big incentive to push forward to what it might be, just to preserve themselves, you know, just to survive.
It's the premise of the runaway species, but I seem to be the philosophical naysayer here. But should we spread our disease and dysfunction elsewhere? Sorry, but we're complex moral beings, and we try and do good stuff, but either intentionally or unintentionally, somebody suffers. And it's not just the risk takers. It's one thing for a risk taker to say, I'm going to go sail here or do this, but there's collateral damage for all of these technologies, for those left back on Earth, for those that go to Mars, the secondary. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do these things, but I think we need to be aware that we are not going to be morally better beings just because we go to Mars. We're going to be the same morally complex beings that we are right now. And we need to take that into account if you set up, like you asked about how you would set up the government or the social organization. Those are good questions.
Can I be the painful optimist then for a minute?
Okay, yes. Please.
I actually think going to Mars would be very good for Earth, because, how do I put this? Okay, so when you're a kid, your house is your home, right? Okay. You go to school, you come home. When you leave your hometown, suddenly it becomes your hometown, right? It's not your hometown until you leave it, right? And then you start saying, oh, I'm going to go home to my hometown. You leave your country, it becomes your home country. I think it would be really great for Earth, for humanity to see Earth as its home.
Yeah.
To be able to step outside of it and appreciate it for what it is, which I think doesn't really happen until you step outside. So.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to the kind of things that we talk about with, like, the Earthrise photo or Carl Sagan's blue dot photo, right?
Yeah.
This kind of, supposedly, arguably, some moments in human history where suddenly our last talk was on borders and boundaries. This is my nice segue to remind you that we had that too. A moment when borders and boundaries are erased, right? Because you look from space, and other than, of course, you know, the literal boundaries of sea and earth and all the rest of it, it's the blue globe floating in the dark. And there is a sense of kind of aching homesickness that seems to be a response to that kind of imagery. And I agree, yeah, I think that would be interesting to see how that would, as a narrative. I mean, things like even, you know, I mean, it was the sort of Cold War era fighting it out, but even the race to the moon, right, produced a kind of cohesion that is to some degree rare, and a self-reflection on what it means to be human or a particular country. And so I think there would be something interesting with that.
Well, I know that a point was brought up about, you know, would we become transhuman by going to Mars? But I think before doing that, people would be not necessarily adapting their bodies so that they could survive better, but you would adapt the world so that you could survive better. You know, with the terraforming technology, I think people would go in that direction and try and make Mars livable without shielding, without having to have spacesuits. But then you get into some ethical issues, such as, could there possibly be any chance of life there? And by so doing this, are you destroying its chances to evolve?
Yeah.
You know, we don't think there's life now on Mars, but we don't actually know. You know, some of the missions are seeing some methane that really shouldn't be there. That can be produced through volcanism. It can be produced through water-rock interactions, but it could be produced by microbiology. And certainly there's liquid water beneath the surface on Mars because there's ice, and the deeper you go, the warmer it is. There's organics. So we know that Mars was habitable. And the question is, would you have the right to change Mars completely if it is inhabited, even by microbes? Do they have the right to evolve and become what they're going to become?
That's actually a really great question. I'm glad you brought that up. And this, I think that speaks to a wider question we were going to sort of get to, and we can bring it all together now, which is that question, right? I mean, NASA goes to great lengths, right, to try and limit the amount of potential microbes we stick on our spacecraft and chuck at things, right? But microbes are really good at surviving stuff, and they survive in space fairly well. So I think that's a very good question, right? And this goes back to your point about, Karen, about the kind of
Infesting the
infesting the universe thing. Is, you know, that is a question, right? Is how do we make that choice, right, of landing in a place, and we would radically have to alter it to survive without simply living in a tin can the entire time. And that's a good point. I mean, how do we reconcile that with the potential that we are disrupting the evolutionary path of, let's say, a planet or a planetoid or a moon or anything?
I seem to be veering from Pollyanna to Doomsayer here, but so I'm going to do both of them in one, which is that I think we're actually morally obliged to leave Earth because so astrobiology, we do these calculations to see what are the odds that there's life elsewhere in the universe, and what do you think?
Absolutely.
There we go.
100%.
Pretty darn high, pretty close to 100%. But what if there isn't? Okay, what if there isn't? What if life on Earth is the only life there is in the universe? And Earth will get destroyed one day, whether it's hit by some big rock or something or whatever. Yeah, but so do we have the responsibility to spread life elsewhere in the universe if this is the only place where it is?
It's a good point. I mean, this is, you know, it's incredibly far in the future, but of course, eventually the sun, the center will likely expand to sort of like a red giant, and therefore our orbit will sort of be like inside the sun, essentially, or close up to it, that we would be uninhabitable. So in a sense, it's not an if, but when.
Oh,
right?
we'll be gone long before then. I mean, we are, if you read Pete Ward, Don Brownlee's book, you know, it's taken us 4.5 billion years to get here. Earth is in its old age. We are like a 60 to 65-year-old planet in terms of life on Earth. Microbes dominated for the first 4 billion years, and we're now, you know, think of it as a clock, a 12-hour clock. At 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock is the age of animals, and then we're back in the age of microbes. So if everything goes really well within 1 billion years, we're back to microbes and most of life is gone. But I bet you it will not go really well. Not because of humanity and technology, but, you know, super volcanoes. Yellowstone is overdue, you know, 700,000 years. And that's a small one.
Or
You know,
an-
some of
or an
the
asteroid.
geologic, no, I don't think that's the biggest problem. I think it's the volcanism.
The volcanoes.
You know, we've had periods where we've had, you know, they talk about volcanoes in terms of cubic kilometers
Mhm.
erupted.
Right.
You know, some of the biggest disasters in the past have been thousands of cubic kilometers. Ancient eruptions were millions of cubic kilometers lasting millions of years. And we see evidence of kilometers thick of lava.
Mhm.
We can't predict those, nothing we can do about it, and if one comes, that will be it. And I think this will happen far sooner than the billion years where we're just down to microbes. So I think we will have to leave, and it will have to be relatively soon. I mean, asteroids come, maybe NASA can do something, but volcanoes, no.
Not much.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm
he's
shocked.
impressed now.
Who wants to go to
Yeah,
Mars?
so someone call Elon Musk for me, because I'm gone. What's my ticket, guys? But I mean, this is actually an interesting question, right? It is, you know, if this is to some degree almost inevitability, I suppose, then it is. I suppose you go at your point. It is more. It's our moral obligation, because if we would like to save our species or any kind of life from Earth to spread out, to continue onwards. Now, it's certainly what people like I think Carl Sagan believed, and kind of, you know, we need to. It should happen. Any other thoughts on this? What do we? We all down with this? We're all gonna go to Mars?
Yeah.
I'm,
Working on it.
I'm struck by have to leave because it adds to our three things that you brought up earlier. The technologist, I mean, Kim brought this up. Can we? Futurist, will we? Ethicist, should we? And now you're saying we have to,
Yeah.
Karen. So
Yeah.
I'm a little concerned about that becomes a moral imperative at all costs. At what costs? And to whom? I guess is the
Well,
ethical
if the
conundrum.
obligation is to preserve life, then it should not be at a cost to life.
Human life. You want to preserve human
No,
life.
no. The
Or
idea
just
was life.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, we can just shoot a whole bunch of stuff out there. It grows. But, you know, between life and human life, I think we've been a little bit loose on that. Sometimes we're talking about life from the microbial level on up, and then sometimes we're talking about humans.
When I was making my moral obligation point, I was talking about life in all its diversity.
Okay,
So-
good. I'm happy with that.
Okay.
So now we have to call Musk and say we want two rockets. One is basically just a Noah's Ark thing where we chuck,
Right.
you know, or it's like that.
Yeah.
And one for the telephone sanitizers.
Is
No?
there?
Oh, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
That's my favorite.
Bring your towel. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So we are reaching towards the end. I do want to make sure we have a time for questions from the audience. But is there anything else anyone would like to add about any of the topics we've jumped into tonight?
I want to hear the questions.
Hear the questions? Yeah. Okay, so we have 15 minutes before I have to kick you all out and go home because we're tired. For any questions you may have, what do we got? Yes.
Thank yourself for choosing me first. Because I want to congratulate you. Big mahalo to you for this amazing series of 4 talks. It was fascinating. I want to say mahalo and aloha on your journey to Japan.
Thank you.
It's moving there for hopefully not forever.
Wow, you really want me to go on?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, please come back. I know you will be back. So my question is, I couldn't attend. I could attend only 2 of those. But is it only a coincidence that on this final panel is exclusively composed of members of the female of our species? One of which, by the way, I suspect is not from this earth.
Oh my The answer to your question is it is entirely coincidental. I sent out as many emails as possible and was very happy with people who responded.
I want to address that because I think it's an important issue. 2 things. One is that Stanford just got in trouble this week because one of their historians, should I give his name or not? I don't know. Niall Ferguson, organized a conference by invitation only through his networks, and he assembled 30 white men.
Oh my.
Now, he said he asked some women, and there were a few women that showed up. But even the chair of his own history department didn't know about this conference that it was taking place. It was a woman of color who didn't know. So this is to congratulate Britain and others, that their network included such a wide variety of people that statistically speaking this could happen. Whereas, what was it said about the Supreme Court? Not Sandra Day O'Connor, the other one.
Notorious Howard.
No, so I just read this quote yesterday and I can't remember now. But, when there will be all women, would it be a problem if there were all women on the Supreme Court? Well, why not? There's been all men. So
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
it may have been her. Yeah, I think it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that. So, I mean, this is an accident in one sense, but in another sense it's not.
Yeah.
I think it also speaks to, in some degrees, UH Manoa as a place. I do think that we have a, not always balanced range of folk in our ranks, but I do think we have a fairly interesting combination of people at UH Manoa, which would allow something like this to happen by virtue of my blanketing the world with emails. But no, I mean, again, it was not intentional, but I'm very happy it happened this way. And I think it made for a wonderful panel.
And on this topic, just to add something, I was the first female professor at the physics department at UH Manoa.
Yeah, well
Yes.
done.
So finally, they opened the door to women. Now we are two, and they hired, I don't know, 5 or 6 men to overcome the shock.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Here's another one. Right side, and then we'll make our way backwards. Right side in the blue, I think, or okay. So Shauna, and then gentleman in the blue after Shauna.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Sorry.
Sure.
Thank you, Britain, by the way, for this. Okay, so I come from the English department where we don't talk about things in billions of years. So for the scientists, I was wondering how is looking at time on such a large scale affected your, like, how you think about life on a day-to-day basis, or your, like, philosophy of living?
Well, I think for me, it's important to take a long view of the future, and so I get upset when I hear inaccuracies and people in the everyday public talking about issues such as global warming and say, well, yeah, I don't have to worry about it, it's not going to bother me, because everything we do now that's changing the environment is important to the future. So I take a longer view look of a lot of issues. Some smaller things that people are tremendously worried about, I don't think about because I think it's just not going to matter in 100 years or 1,000 years. I'm more worried about those volcanic eruptions. So. I just look at the day-to-day living a little bit differently in that sense.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I said there were other questions.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Gentleman in the blue in front of Shauna. Sorry.
Going back to your question or comment about like losing our like body, what do you think about like the possibility of like hive mind?
Back to the question of
Yeah.
individuality.
I think we'd be really losing a lot of creativity. I think without the individual, I really do think we'd cease to be human. Because then you're just following orders, and we've seen so much in history that has been disastrous when you don't think for yourself. So every science fiction, I'm a big fan of science fiction, and every show that has hive minds just goes down the track to gloom and doom. I have never thought of that question before, but I think we'd lose an awful lot.
Like, for instance, like bees.
Even so, bees are individuals. They have a more collective thought, but their individual bodies are still quite important in how the way they all work together. I mentioned evolutionary computing earlier, and the magic of evolutionary computing is that every creature in evolutionary computing, every one of these antennas, for example, is a potential solution to the problem. So when we have a large population of individual humans, every single one of those are at some level, a potential solution. Whereas if you have, thinking very engineeringly, whereas if you sort of all clump together into one, then you either get it wrong or you fail, and then you're done.
Excellent. Wonderful. Yes.
So for when the second generation is born on Mars, will they be considered aliens because they're not from Earth? And if not, will they ever be considered aliens because they're not from Earth?
Good question.
How will they change?
They will be considered Martians.
Yeah.
I mean,
But they still be humans.
It'd still be humans, and then
Yes.
Earthlings would be Earthlings,
And
right?
humans evolved on Earth.
Yeah. I think it wouldn't take long for them to start. I mean, first they would have physiological responses to it. So you get people with weaker bones and cardiovascular systems that are different. That's not even mutating yet. But then I think it wouldn't take many generations for
To
TC
mutate.
to actually mutate. Yeah.
yeah, and to adapt to the
Yeah.
conditions of Mars.
I think, sorry, if I could jump on that. I think part also as well, I mean, that would be part of the way they would draw a collective identity, right? Is the fact that we are Martians. I think one way they could somehow make the second generation less horrible for people is to inculcate that kind of wonder and joy. Like, you are Martians. You are different and interesting and amazing.
Right, yeah.
It's tribalism.
Exists for a reason.
Potentially positive way, at least in terms of their survival. But I do think that would likely occur. I think it would be a way to create group cohesion and identity, and I think that they would
Right.
very quickly see themselves as distinct.
But they would still be humans.
Yeah.
If
Yes.
we're defining humans as having some other qualities other than just the particular
Yes.
bone structure and those kinds of things.
Yeah,
Yes.
and certainly at the beginning we'll do what everyone does when they move from home. I noticed me when I moved from Italy here. You try to reproduce somehow what is familiar to you. Then you realize that it's impossible. You you cannot make the same pizza as you were eating in Italy.
Which
So
makes us all very
you
sad.
start to
Yes.
adapt yourself and you enrich yourself
Mm.
with the culture of the place. So. Who knows how they will evolve? So this will bring a lot of new creativity and new innovations,
I think
in
we're
their
creating art.
life. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're talking about
Yeah.
cultural change, not
Cultural change.
in the human
Right.
being.
Yeah.
Yeah, which are sort of together, I suppose. But yeah. Excellent. Okay, next question. Yes.
So I originally had a question, now I have another one on this. So I have two questions. So you're talking about social change, correct? So if we were to go and have that first generation go into Mars, and they were to reproduce and have a second generation, and say their bones did become a little bit more hollow, right? And they started having mutations. And so that third generation had even more mutations. So going back to our human history, right, with our mutations, correct? Does that necessarily mean that they will be considered humans? Or will they go through so much mutation that they are no longer considered humans, but their ancestors were humans?
So an isolated population is eventually going to drift far enough that they will speciate. I am not a biologist, so the whole speciation, but it takes a long time.
Long time.
So you might think of it more as
Genetic differences in isolated populations.
yeah.
That we treat as race today, which is false. But
But it's not, for instance, like Neanderthal and Homo
Eventually.
erectus
no,
or
no. Homo sapiens sapiens, there's only one
Sapiens.
race. Okay? I'm a little concerned, and I didn't bring this up, but there's the whole issue of genetic engineering right now, and you can get your genes tested. American Historical Association just had an article about the problem with people, and someone said this to me, oh, I got my gene tested through Ancestry.com or whatever, and I'm this much, I'm all white, and I don't have any African American blood. And I thought, that's not science. Right? There's no science of different races. It's a construct, and then people identify certain traits, culturally speaking, hair, nose, lip, skin tone, and then you can look for those genetically. But there's only one human race, folks. And so what we're talking about is Homo sapiens sapiens evolving over millennia into something else, whether it's on this planet or another planet. It would take an incredibly long
Yeah, but what would happen a lot
Even
faster?
intentionally. It might happen faster, yeah, true.
Well, what
true.
would happen faster is changes in gene expression.
Right.
Would happen very quickly. That even happened with the twin astronaut in space. By the way, his genes didn't change, his DNA didn't change, just the gene expression changed.
Yeah.
But that would happen really quickly, and also you would probably get these.
Well, you have a limited genetic population,
Limited
right?
genetic
So if you had
population,
100
yeah.
people there, 200 people there, then you don't have the diversity, unless more people came from Earth and added to the
Yeah,
gene
that
pool,
would
you
be
would get an isolated population with certain genetic traits.
And you would also get the physiological changes that are not genetic, not hereditary, but those might be significant enough to prevent you from returning to Earth.
Right.
And that would be a huge cultural shift when
Yeah.
when you know that neither you nor any of your descendants are going to be able to physically return to Earth because it would break you. That would be a big shift.
Yeah.
Now, my second question was going back to in the very beginning of the discussion when we were talking about what makes us human. So, if we're altering our bodies, someone had mentioned that no longer makes us human. So, my question is, if we are altering our DNA, or we're maybe having children and we're altering their DNA so that way they don't have to wear glasses or whatever other disease is known in our genetic code, and we're altering those things to a certain extent, does that make us, or does that make them human, or does that make us human if we're continuing to alter those genes?
If what it means to be human is based only on genetics, yes. But I think we've tried to establish here that what it means to be human is not something that's purely measured by biological things or genetic things. I mean, would we lose our creativity? Would we lose that ability to do abstract linguistic communication? Would we lose traits that we now see as making us definitively humans as different from other animals? Would we do that on purpose? One of my concerns is eugenics. Sorry, I'm the naysayer here, but I'm really concerned about eugenics. That we forget that humans have always been manipulating the gene pool at very slow rates. Now we can do it really, really fast. But there's the possibility of a new eugenics movement with this DNA testing thing that's going on.
And I have a question now.
Excellent.
So what if, taking what the girl was just saying, that is very interesting, and what you were saying also that is interesting, if we consider that instead we have some people that they decide to change themselves genetically, and some other humans that decide instead to not do such a thing. So then we have the same period of time, two type of generations of human plus, let's call them, with this genetical improvement, and standard humans.
It makes the Olympic Games extremely difficult.
We already saw somehow with, this, with the guy with the legs.
That's an
Yeah.
interesting question there. I
It
mean,
is, yeah.
particularly if it was in a place with a small population like a Mars colony. And what if there was, I mean, again, there's lots of pop culture sort of explorations of this where they look at, you know, what it would mean if there is, and this is about your power thing, right? So some alter themselves, and let's say some don't for religious reasons. I mean, it alter carbon. I feel like an altered carbon. I should get paid for this. An altered carbon. They actually do explore this specific question because there is a specific group of people who believe that you should die. You should only have one lifetime, and they refuse to have this thing done essentially that makes it so you can keep going. And so and that, in a sense, makes a huge stratification of society and culture there. So I think it's an important question. But then, of course, in a small colony, could you really stop them from breeding? You know, I mean, like if you know, I can see this like the family drama be like of Earth projected outwards, where you have the human plus person and the human normal person, and they fall in love, and it's like Romeo and Juliet again, except in space, which would be great, an interesting story. But I do think it would kind of, to some degree, end up there in one way or for another. But it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I don't like your comment on small colony,
Oh,
because
sorry.
I don't think you could have a small colony and be successful,
Right.
especially if it's going to be independent. You need huge amount of biodiversity.
Right.
If we saw anything from, say, the Biosphere 2 experiment in Arizona, where they brought thousands of species in there to do an enclosed experiment and found oxygen levels were dropping. They couldn't sustain themselves even with that kind of ecosystem. So I think if you're going to have a colony that's going to survive on its own, it's not going to be small. It's going to have to be big.
Okay.
Hundreds of thousands of people.
We have time for possibly one more question. Let's do the final question. Evening. Yes.
You've been talking about how you identify what is human, and Kim talked about the line between humans and animals and the fuzzy which way it went. I'm interested about the other end. If we do genetic mutations or manipulation, is there some point at which we will no longer be human, but we will be something else, be it artificial intelligence or superhuman or human plus, or is there some point at which we would think we are not human anymore?
I mean, so, okay, there's the boring biological answer, which is, you know, when we can't breed with humans, we're not human.
That's a good answer.
You know, that's how you define species. I mean, the biologists in the room might shoot me because there's more to it, but it's a pretty good line. Another might be when we can't communicate with humans. Now this is assuming we need to keep some humans around so that we can keep testing this, right? But yeah, I think that you know, when you can't communicate with humans, that would be a big point. Other ones?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, okay. Last question, though. I do have to close. I'm sorry.
Is technology mating with us? Is once it is inserted into our body, is that the penetration? Seriously.
Does technology have agency? Because we create the technology. It doesn't have independent existence or...
Some technology is leaning towards agency. You know, and that's going to be an interesting line to cross as well.
I mean, I love Data on Star Trek.
Yeah.
I mean, he's my favorite character, but I'm dubious.
Some technology has priorities and goals that are not necessarily exactly what was pre-programmed into them.
Interesting.
Now, they're not sort of big and sophisticated. I don't think they're at the level that we need to necessarily be worried about them howling us. Yeah, but we're getting there, for better or for worse.
All right, well, this is really a wonderful conversation. I know what I'll love to say, but they're going to kick us out pretty soon, so I might as well end. So if we could please have a round of applause for our amazing
And for our host.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I hope this was really generative for you and was very fascinating. Please continue these conversations. The point of this is to think about how the biggest issues of our world and new ideas, interesting perspectives, the problems we will face, because these are, again, going problems we will face, are best served when we come together from a variety of perspectives. So we have a variety of different scientists, we have some humanists up here, you all have your own backgrounds and sets of knowledge and abilities. And only by coming together can we actually have any hope of doing this, because they are too complex and interesting for us to possibly do it otherwise. So seek out each other, be helpful, and be hopeful. As much as we've been sort of half gloom and doom, half hope, be hopeful, as I am. Thank you again. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That got me going. I'm sorry I didn't mean to do, Sarah, but...
We need at least one, Sarah.